Good evening and a really warm welcome to day 2 of our online Alpha course. Really good to see you. Thank you for joining us again. I hope you really enjoyed yesterday evening's talk. I hope it gave you lots to think about. And for those of you who were able to be on the online discussion, I hope that you found that really fruitful and you enjoyed spending time discussing the stuff that we talked about yesterday with others. Tonight we're looking at the whole question of who is Jesus. But before we do that, just to mention that the Alpha course, there's a book which accompanies the Alpha course. It's called Questions of Life. It's a great book and it just goes into a bit more detail about the stuff that I'm covering each evening. It's a great book by Nicky Gumbel. You'll be able to get this online, no problem at all. Questions of Life by Nicky Gumbel. And for those of you particularly who enjoy reading, I would really recommend you getting hold of a copy, particularly during lockdown when we've got that little bit more time to do some reading. So tonight, who is Jesus? For pretty much all of my life, I have been a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. I have got Christian parents. I married Jill, who is a Christian. And in a sense, Christianity is all that I have ever known. And I'm actually extremely grateful for that. But occasionally, I do wonder what my life might look like if I weren't a Christian. Would life be more exciting, perhaps? Would I spend my weekends watching football or going off into the Yorkshire Dales on that motorbike that I spoke about yesterday? If I wasn't a Christian, what sorts of questions would I be asking? What sorts of things would lead me to a place where I wanted to examine the Christian faith? And if I'm honest, because of my sceptical nature, my sceptical personality, one of the first things I think that I would want to know of the Christian faith is it true? That would be my first question. Can the Christian faith hold up to scrutiny and intellectual interrogation? What is the evidence, if you like, behind the Christian faith? These are the sorts of questions I think I would be asking if I wasn't already a Christian. And these are the sorts of questions we're going to be looking at this evening. What is the evidence that underpins the Christian faith? Now, I don't believe that you can prove Christianity in the way that you can prove mathematics or science. That's not really the way that faith works. But the Christian faith is based on evidence. And it is possible to build a case, rather like you would build a case in a court of law. It is possible to build a case for the Christian faith. And we're not talking here about suspending all our reason, all our common sense and all our intelligence. What we're talking about is taking a step of faith based on good, solid, historical evidence. And that evidence, of course, is the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what being a Christian means. That's what Christianity means. It means being a follower of Jesus Christ. So what is the evidence for Jesus? Who is Jesus? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even ever existed in the first place? Well, the answer, thankfully, to that basic fundamental question is that there is a great deal of evidence. The Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about Jesus. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says this. He's talking about Pontius Pilate, and he writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it is lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works." Josephus then goes on to talk about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. You will notice that these are not Christian historians. If you know your history, you will know that the last thing in the world that a Roman or Jewish historian would want to have done is give Jesus any significance or any prominence whatsoever. These good historians spoke about Jesus because they were good historians and they just couldn't and wouldn't ignore the facts and the evidence. So there is very strong evidence that Jesus existed outside of the Christian texts of the Bible. There is also, obviously, a wealth of evidence from inside the scriptures, and particularly inside the New Testament, that Jesus did exist. Well, some people would say, of course, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what was written has not been changed or doctored or altered over the years? And there aren't there, lots of conspiracy theories about the New Testament. There's all sorts of talk of hidden papers and hidden books locked away in the Vatican or other places, and if ever discovered, these would blow Christianity out of the water. There's all sorts of theories. So in the face of all these various conspiracy theories, how do we know whether we can rely on the accounts we find in the New Testament or not? Well, the answer I would suggest is that we can rely on the New Testament accounts because of something called textual criticism. Through the science of textual criticism, we can have real confidence that the Bible, the New Testament, particularly as we know it, is the real deal. Now, I don't claim to know a great deal about textual criticism. In fact, I don't know anything about textual criticism. But in a nutshell, it works like this. The more manuscripts we have, and the earlier those manuscripts were written, the less doubt there is about the contents of those originals. Let's have a look at this slide. On this slide, you will see that when we look at other ancient texts, you'll see that Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy that we have is from AD 900, and we have just 8 copies of each manuscript. Tacitus, there is a 1,000-year time gap between when it was written and the first known manuscript that we have, and we've got 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, we've got 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, there is a 900-year gap, and we've got 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130, and we've got full manuscripts by AD 350. We've got 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 other manuscripts. It is interesting how people do not question the historical validity of Tacitus or Caesar or Livy, but they do question the New Testament. And yet, as we can see, the textual evidence is overwhelming. One of the greatest textual critics ever, John Hort, said this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." So, we know from evidence both within and without, inside and outside the New Testament, that Jesus did actually exist as a real person, as a real man here on the earth. But that does still leave the question, doesn't it? Who was he? Who was Jesus? Many people today would say, okay, Jesus did exist, but really he was just an amazing human being. He was a great religious figure. So, for example, Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code suggests that Jesus was not the Son of God. He was a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man of staggering influence, a great religious teacher, but not the Son of God. Whereas, on the other hand, Bono, lead singer of U2, says this: "I do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I do believe it, odd as it may sound." So that's the issue, I think, for us tonight. There is incredibly strong evidence to suggest that Jesus did exist here on the earth, but what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great man or a great religious teacher? Matthew's Gospel says this: "When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say I am?' They replied, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets.'" In other words, 2,000 years ago, people were still having this very same debate. People were saying, even 2,000 years ago, that Jesus was just a great religious teacher. But what about you? Jesus asks the disciples. Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It is an extraordinary statement, isn't it? Simon Peter was this ordinary, hard-working, working-class, no-nonsense man. He believed that Jesus was not just a great religious teacher, but he actually was the Son of God. You know, it is possible to spend time with somebody and not really realise who they really are. I had an embarrassing experience a few years ago when I was a trainee vicar in Bristol. And on this particular Sunday, a gentleman walked into the back of church. I was preaching. I remember I was up in the pulpit, and this gentleman walked in at the back of the church halfway through the service. And to my great shame, I assumed that this guy was coming to church to ask for a food parcel. He looked like he was perhaps a bit down on his luck, and I made a point of thinking as I was preaching, I must go and speak to him at the end of the service and see if he's okay, which I did. I went after the service had ended. We were having coffee, and I approached him and got chatting to him, and I got the impression that actually, he was okay. He didn't need a food parcel after all. Anyway, as I said goodbye to this gentleman and he walked off, the church warden collared me. And he said, do you know who that was? And I said, no, I don't. I'm sorry. Who was it? He said, it's Jerry Dammers. And the name rung a bell, and then it suddenly dawned on me. Jerry Dammers was a musician in the band The Specials, a huge band with some incredible hits to their name. Top 10, they sang Much Too Young, they sang Ghost Train. And not long before this guy had walked into my church and I'd almost asked him if he wanted a food parcel, Jerry Dammers had headlined a concert in Hyde Park in honour of Nelson Mandela. An incredibly large and famous concert. Huge figures were there on the stage. Amy Winehouse, Queen, Simple Minds, the Prime Minister was there, royalty were there. Nelson Mandela himself was there, and the headline act of that concert was Jerry Dammers. One night he was headlining a concert in Hyde Park. A few weeks later I was asking him if he wanted a food parcel. Sometimes you can be in the presence of somebody and not really realise who they are. The disciples, though, they didn't have that problem. They spent time with Jesus and they said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. They recognised Jesus for who he really was. And so the question for us tonight is this: were the disciples right? What is the evidence that Jesus was, and indeed still is, the Son of God? There's two parts to this argument, really. The first part is to ask, who did Jesus himself think that he was? Because if Jesus himself didn't think that he was anything more than a great religious teacher or a significant human being, then that's kind of the end of the argument. Who did Jesus think that he was? The second part of the argument, though, is if Jesus himself thought that he was the Son of God, then was he right? What evidence is there to support Jesus' claims? So let's look at the first part of the argument first. What did Jesus have to say about himself? Well, first of all, let's look at Jesus' teaching. Jesus was the most humble, the most self-effacing person who ever lived. And yet he made this extraordinary claim about himself. He said, it's only through me that you can come into relationship with God. Jesus made these incredible claims about himself. He said, I am the bread of life. We spoke yesterday, didn't we, about how we all have this spiritual hunger inside of us. Freud said, people are hungry for love. Jung said, people are hungry for security. Adler said, people are hungry for significance. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. In other words, if you want your spiritual hunger satisfying, then you can only do that through me. Addiction is a major problem in our society. Jesus said, I can set you free. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Many people are depressed, disillusioned, in despair. They're in a dark place. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. We live in a society where we don't like to talk about death, don't we? We say people have passed away. Mother Teresa was asked shortly before her death, are you afraid of dying? She said, how can I be? Dying is going home. I've never been afraid. On the contrary, she said, I'm really looking forward to it. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live even though they die. Materialism can never satisfy us. People are looking for some kind of spiritual satisfaction in materialism or consumerism. Jesus said, I am the way. People are looking for values on which to base their lives. Jesus said, I am the truth. All of us want some sort of meaning, some purpose to our lives. Jesus said, I am the life. I heard about a 5-year-old child who was drawing a picture, and the mother said to the child, what are you doing? The child said, I'm drawing a picture of God. So the mother said, don't be silly, you can't draw a picture of God. Nobody knows what God looks like. The child said, well, they will do once I've finished my drawing. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, then look at me. If you want to know what the Father looks like, then look at the Son. That's the first piece of evidence. Jesus is teaching about himself. The second piece of evidence is a kind of indirect piece of evidence. Jesus said a number of things about himself which, although they weren't direct claims to be God, they showed that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. So to take one example, Jesus said to various people, your sins are forgiven. Now we can all forgive somebody if they have sinned against us, but to forgive a third party for something that they have done to somebody else, well, that's only something that God can do. Jesus was taking a huge risk by claiming that he could forgive sins. He could have been charged with blasphemy. Blasphemy was an offence punishable by stoning, but nevertheless, Jesus made this claim about himself. He claimed that he could forgive sins just like God. Third piece of evidence are Jesus's direct claims. For example, after the resurrection, Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side, stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Thomas says to Jesus, my Lord and my God. And Jesus didn't say, hey, hold on a minute, that's going a bit far. What Jesus said was this, it took you long enough to work it out. So that's the first part of the argument. From Jesus' teaching and from what Jesus said about himself both directly and indirectly, we can see that Jesus very clearly believed that he was the Son of God. Obviously, claims like this need to be tested. All kinds of people claim to be all kinds of things. There's lots of people who claim to be a reincarnated Elvis Presley. That doesn't mean that they are Elvis Presley. So how do we test these claims? How do we test whether what Jesus said about himself was true? Well, it seems to me that there are a whole variety of possibilities that we could go into, but basically we've got three options. The first is to say that Jesus' claims were not true and that Jesus knew they weren't true, in which case Jesus was an imposter or a fraudster, he was a con man, and he was a pretty evil one at that. The second possibility is that Jesus' claims weren't true, but Jesus didn't realise that they weren't true. Jesus genuinely did think that he was the Son of God, in which case Jesus was deluded. We'd perhaps say that Jesus was insane. The only other logical possibility is that it is actually all true. Jesus indeed was and is the Son of God, just as he claimed. C.S. Lewis, the great author, put it like this. He said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't just be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he was insane or something worse. But do not let us come up with any patronising nonsense about him being just a great human teacher. He hasn't left that option open to us. He didn't intend to. So what evidence is there to support what Jesus said about himself? Well, firstly, I guess one area we might want to look at is this. What did Jesus teach? Jesus' teaching. Well, the teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that this world has ever seen. Love your neighbour as you love your neighbour as you love yourself. Do to others what you would have do to you. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of the entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws are based originally on the teachings of Jesus. We're making progress in every field of science and technology, but no one has ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus Christ. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words that you would expect God himself to speak. And if you haven't looked at Jesus' teaching, then could I invite you to take a good look for yourself. Go to Matthew's Gospel, look at the Sermon on the Mount. There are so many examples of incredible teaching that come from the lips of Jesus. Then there is Jesus' lifestyle, the things that Jesus did. You know, Jesus must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. Sometimes people say, oh, being Christian must be really boring. Well, it wouldn't have been boring being around Jesus. We read in Scripture that he turned water into wine. That's pretty cool. We read that Jesus said to a man who had been crippled for 38 years, get up, take up your bed and walk. And the man walked fully and completely healed. We read that Jesus fed 4,000 to 5,000 people with just a few bits of bread and fish. If you're not convinced by Jesus' miracles, then what about Jesus' care for the poor? His love for those people whose society had completely written off, the outcasts. What about the way that his ministry was all about serving the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalised? Would a fraudster or a con man, would somebody who was deluded or mad really spend their time caring for people in such a way? So we've had Jesus' teaching, Jesus' lifestyle. There's also Jesus' character. Jesus' character has impressed millions of people who would not necessarily call themselves Christians. There was an article in The Spectator a few years ago by Matthew Parris, who describes himself as an avowed atheist. Matthew Parris said this: I've got such huge respect for Jesus because his life was so radical. It was so inconvenient. He said this: if Jesus had not existed, the church most certainly would not have invented him. In other words, if the church needed to come up with a visionary, revolutionary leader, they would not have come up with somebody like Jesus. Jesus' teaching and his lifestyle was the polar opposite of what many people think makes a great leader. And I would suggest in this day and age, particularly as we look at our leaders, then Jesus is a polar opposite of what we think makes a great leader these days. Look at what Jesus said when he was being tortured. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Could such a loving, forgiving, radical, compassionate human being really be evil or unbalanced or simply a con artist? That's Jesus' lifestyle. Fourthly, the way that Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies, prophecies which had been written hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. It could be suggested that Jesus was an elaborate con man, that he'd read all these prophecies and then he thought, right, I'm going to go out and make them all seem like they were written about me. The difficulty with that, of course, is the sheer number of them, literally hundreds and hundreds of prophecies. And secondly, there's the fact that Jesus had no control over many of these events. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, the place of his burial, about the place of his birth. Jesus, if he was just a con man or a fraudster, could never have engineered those situations for himself. Fifth piece of evidence, and by far the most important, was Jesus' physical resurrection. Jesus' physical resurrection from the dead is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. It is also perhaps the most controversial and the most difficult aspect of the Christian faith for people to get their heads around. So what evidence is there that the resurrection actually happened? Well, there's more arguments than we can go into here. If you'd like to know more about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, then do email in and we could go into it in more detail. There are more arguments than this, but let me summarise under four excuse me. Let me summarise under four main headings. First of all, Jesus' absence from the tomb, the absence of the body. Many theories have been put forward to explain the fact that Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on that first Easter day. None of those theories, I would suggest, are very convincing. It's been suggested that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he recovered in some way and was revived in the cool of the tomb. If any of you have seen Mel Gibson's film The Passion, then you will know just what it meant to undergo a Roman flogging and crucifixion. People did not survive crucifixion. Roman soldiers were very efficient. Their livelihoods, their lives depended on it. If Jesus hadn't been well and truly dead, those Roman soldiers would have faced severe punishment themselves. There's also a fascinating little piece of evidence from John's Gospel. It says this, that when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Breaking legs was a way to speed up death by crucifixion. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. It appears that there had been this separation in the blood of what we call the clot and the serum. And we now know that there is good medical scientific evidence that this proves that somebody is truly dead. The gospel writers did not have access to that sort of medical knowledge. People didn't know at that time about the separation of in the blood of the clot and the serum when people die. The gospel writers were simply reporting what they saw. This was eyewitness testimony. Others have said, well, maybe the authorities took the body from the tomb and hid it away. Well, this is probably the least likely explanation of all. We have only got to look at how our authorities behave when they want to prove somebody has died. We've seen it with Saddam Hussein and his sons, with Colonel Gaddafi and his family, with Osama bin Laden. When they were killed, the authorities wanted everybody to know for sure that those people were dead. There was no logical reason why the Roman and Jewish authorities would want to hide the body. Jesus was a nuisance. The authorities wanted rid of him. The fact that there were people running around and saying Jesus is risen from the dead was awkward. It was embarrassing. It made the authorities look foolish. All the authorities would have to do, if they had hidden the body, was to say, of course he's not risen from the dead. Don't be stupid. Here's the body. Now stop all this nonsense. But they couldn't do it because they hadn't hidden the body. There was no body to hide. The second piece of evidence is this. Jesus was seen in person way after the time of his death by many, many different people. Now, some people would say, well, that's just people's imaginations. That's just people hallucinating. And of course, especially when people are grieving, people do see things, they hear things, they hallucinate, they have vivid imaginations. But it is highly unlikely that even two people would have the same vision or hallucination at the same time. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have seen the same vision or hallucination at the same time. The third piece of evidence is the immediate impact on the disciples. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding, and then something occurred after Jesus had been killed that totally changed them forever. They were so changed that they went around telling everybody, risking their lives, making this outrageous statement that we have seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. I don't know about you, but if I was one of those disciples, if I knew that even mentioning that Jesus was risen from the dead could well lead to my own crucifixion, then I'd have had to make very certain of my facts before I would say anything. I would not have risked my own life. I would not have risked the lives of my family by making such outrageous statements unless I was absolutely sure of what I was saying. Let's face it, the disciples had nothing to gain from making this statement. At best, they would be laughed at, they would be ridiculed, and at worst, they would be killed and crucified themselves. They could have quite easily have accepted Jesus' death and turned Jesus into a martyr. They could have done that without hiding bodies. They could have done that without making this outrageous claim that he was risen from the dead. Plenty of religions, plenty of cults have prospered after their leader has been martyred. The disciples were making this brave and outrageous claim because, in my opinion, they believed, they knew it was based on fact. They knew that Jesus had risen from the dead. As we draw to a close, Sherlock Holmes said this. He said, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And I suppose what I've been trying to argue tonight is that when you look at the claims of Jesus, when you look at who he himself claimed that he was, we're left with three possibilities. Either Jesus was mad, or Jesus was bad, or Jesus was telling the truth. When we look at his teaching, his life, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say that he was evil or deluded just doesn't make sense. It is absurd, it is illogical. And so having eliminated those things, all we are left with is the truth. C.S. Lewis says this. He put it this way: "We are faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we are talking about was and is just who he said he was, or else he was insane or something worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is the Son of God." Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for joining us again tonight on this day 2 of our Alpha course. Again, a reminder that if you'd like to join in the post-Alpha Talk discussion groups, then just email in alpha@holytrinityidol.org.uk. That's alpha@holytrinityidol.org.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get you involved in those discussions. Or if you'd rather not join a discussion but you do have questions, then again, just email them in at that email address. We can't promise that we will be able to answer all your questions. We can't promise we'll give you the answer that you want. But I can promise that we will take them seriously and we will do our best to respond to each and every one of them. So again, thank you for listening. Same time again tomorrow for day 3 of our Alpha course. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 7 o'clock.